Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. We're jumping right into a really fascinating and honestly profoundly important topic today. We're looking at that delicate intersection of spiritual care, ethical boundaries, and legal compliance. Specifically, we're diving into the exact names and titles that biblical counselors are actually allowed to call themselves, both in their notes and in their ministry of soul care. You know, words matter immensely. And when you're dealing with soul care, the wrong word isn't just a simple typo. It can literally be the difference between a faithful, thriving ministry and a devastating lawsuit.
Take a look at this quote from Restoring Hope Ministries, or RHM. They state, RHM is not looking for casual advice givers. I think that immediately sets the tone for us, right? Biblical counseling is sacred, heavy work. You're sitting with highly vulnerable people who might be carrying intense trauma, deep grief, or serious addiction. Because the stakes are incredibly high, the language counselors use to define their roles has to be held to a massive standard of reverence and accountability. There's just no room for casual labels here.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the weight of a title, move into approved ministry care titles, and then cover avoiding clinical role drift. After that, we'll look at the legal and ethical why, charting with humble restraint, and wrap up with how true care protects the vulnerable.
So, Section 1. The weight of a title. Let's talk about words in ministry.
Now, the major pitfall we absolutely have to avoid here is something called clinical role drift. What is that? Well, it's what happens when someone functioning in a pastoral role unintentionally starts adopting regulated clinical terms. And it usually happens super innocently. A counselor is just trying to sound professional in their notes, right? But here's the problem. Drifting into clinical language falsely implies that the minister holds a state license authority that they simply don't have.
And we need to understand that these strict naming conventions, they aren't just annoying administrative red tape. Not at all. They are an expression of deep biblical ethics and humility. As our source material highlights, ethics don't replace Scripture. True biblical ethics actually flow directly out of the character of God, a commitment to telling the truth, and a non-negotiable mandate to protect the vulnerable.
Moving on to Section 2, Approved Ministry Care Titles. Let's look at the actual vocabulary.
So the big question, what names can you actually use? Well, clarity creates safety. Under RHDM's guidelines, your approved helper titles are biblical counselor, pastoral counselor, or mentor. For the people receiving care, you call them a counselee, a participant, or a resident. That's it. Sticking to these specific words securely anchors you in a pastoral context without ever accidentally stepping on the toes of state-regulated medical boards. But that begs a pretty vital question, doesn't it? What actually happens when a well-meaning pastor writes down the word psychotherapy or diagnosis in a ministry note, even if it's just a private thought jotted down on a Tuesday afternoon?
That brings us to Section 3, Avoiding Clinical Role Drift, the pastoral versus clinical divide.
Let's contrast these two worlds side by side. Titles like therapist, psychotherapist, and clinician, those belong strictly to the regulated clinical sphere, period. On the pastoral side, you have biblical counselor, pastoral counselor, or care minister. Using clinical titles without a state-issued license falsely implies that you're providing regulated psychotherapy. Even if you aren't trying to deceive anyone at all, just using the word therapist legally confuses the scope of your care. You have to stick to the approved pastoral terms.
And hey, this brilliant little language shift applies directly to your documentation too. You aren't making a treatment plan, you're crafting a biblical care plan. You don't provide a diagnosis or treat symptoms. Instead, you write down a presenting concern or a reported struggle. See the difference? This keeps everything factually truthful about a person's distress, but it completely avoids drifting into illegal diagnostic framing.
The exact same principle applies to the techniques you document. You wouldn't write psychoeducation. A biblical counselor uses wisdom instruction. Instead of clinical cognitive restructuring, you'd write examining assumptions before God. And instead of a grounding skill, you document embodied stewardship. By doing this, we are capturing the actual concrete pastoral care being provided, but we're doing it using truthful language instead of importing clinical claims.
Okay. Section 4, the legal and ethical why. Let's talk about Wisconsin's scope rules.
To really grasp why this is so strict, we just impartially look at Wisconsin state law, which governs RHM's practices. Wisconsin Statute 457.02 allows you to use a title like pastoral counselor, but, and this is a massive but, only if you don't imply that you hold a state license. On the flip side, Statute 457.04 explicitly prohibits practicing psychotherapy without a credential. The law doesn't mind if you provide pastoral counsel, it absolutely minds if you illegally represent yourself as a licensed pro.
Furthermore, the state has an administrative code that outlines rules for unprofessional conduct. And what's super interesting is that RHMs actually adopts these, not because they're legally bound to clinical boards, but because they serve as foundational wisdom guardrails. Things like keeping timely records, ensuring truthfulness, avoiding dual relationships, and maintaining strict confidentiality. These are just incredibly smart ways to keep ministry care totally above reproach.
Next up is Section 5, Charting with Humble Restraint. This is all about translating those SOAP notes.
So how does this actually look when you sit down to write your notes? The golden rule here is do not change the skeleton. You don't need to invent some wildly new charting system to be biblically faithful. RHM uses the super familiar SOAP format: subjective, objective, assessment, plan. But they apply intense, disciplined language within that structure, translating it into an accurate pastoral frame.
Let's look at the objective section of a SOAP note. You want to document exactly what you did, right? Say your action was Christ-like questioning. Your note would read something like, Biblical counselor used open, searching questions to invite truthfulness. And then, this is the cool part, you anchor that action to Scripture, like Genesis 3:9. You successfully documented the intervention without clinicalizing it.
Those little scripture references you include, those are called scripture parentheticals, and they are absolutely critical. You use them to show the biblical logic behind what you did. They are your documentation anchors, but listen, they are never ever to be used as weapons or to spiritually manipulate a counselee. And they definitely aren't proof texting shortcuts. Legally and ethically, they just prove that your intervention was pastoral and built on a biblical framework.
And finally, Section 6, True Care Protects the Vulnerable, Understanding Limits and Escalation.
A massive part of protecting the vulnerable is simply knowing your limits. True care requires knowing when to report and when to escalate. First, you have to identify when a concern exceeds your scope, like say imminent danger or suspected child abuse. Once you spot that, step 2 is consulting your pastoral supervision. And step 3 is escalating it to licensed, medical, or protective services. Knowing your exact title means knowing exactly when a crisis requires someone with a different title.
Now, if you take away nothing else today, let it be this summary rule. Never use documentation language to imply that a biblical counselor diagnosed, treated, or clinically evaluated a counselee unless they actually hold that specific state license. By staying strictly within the approved vocabulary, words like biblical counselor, pastoral care plan, and reported struggle, you prevent dangerous overreach. And more importantly, you protect absolutely everyone involved.
Biblical ethics does not lower the standard of care, it raises the reverence of care. I absolutely love this quote. Operating as a biblical counselor doesn't mean you get a free pass to be sloppy with your words or your paperwork just because you rely on Scripture. Quite the opposite. Strict, truthful documentation is a direct, tangible expression of your wisdom and your reverence before God.
I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to reflect on. If our words as care providers are ultimately meant to bring healing, to bring structure, and to bring hope, are your titles telling the truth? Because language is powerful, and in the sacred care of souls, honesty in our documentation is the very foundation of trust. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.